Some places are forgotten by the world for a reason, but every once in a while, a forgotten place remembers someone back. The rain came down in long silver lines across the empty rail yard outside Black Hollow, Montana, turning the rusted tracks into ribbons of dull copper beneath the storm. Wind pushed through the valley with a low, mournful hum, rattling broken signal poles and loose sheets of metal that hadn't moved in years. At the far edge of the abandoned yard, half swallowed by weeds and darkness, an old train car sat crooked on dead rails like the skeleton of another century. Faded letters barely clung to its peeling paint, and one shattered window blinked faintly whenever lightning crossed the mountains. Elias Mercer pulled his old canvas coat tighter around himself as he guided his pickup truck through the mud beside the tracks. The truck coughed twice before dying completely. "That's about right," he muttered softly. Beside him, Ranger lifted his head from the passenger seat. The 6-year-old German shepherd watched the train car through the rain-streaked windshield with focused amber eyes that reflected each flash of distant lightning. Elias stepped out into the cold. Mud soaked through his boots instantly. The smell of wet iron and pine drifted through the storm, sharp enough to remind him of long nights overseas where rain had carried entirely different memories. He pushed them away the same way he always did, quietly, without a fight anymore. Ranger jumped down beside him, his thick silver and cream coat already darkening beneath the rain. The dog moved carefully toward the train car, ears high, paws silent against the gravel. Every few seconds he stopped and listened, not to the storm, but to something underneath it. Elias noticed, but said nothing. Ranger had always heard things before other people did. Sometimes vibrations, sometimes trouble, sometimes things Elias could never explain. The old train car groaned softly as the wind pushed against it. One of the doors hung partially open, swaying an inch back and forth with a rusty creak that sounded strangely human in the empty rail yard. "Looks dry enough," Elias said. "Better than freezing in." The truck. Inside, the air smelled like wet wood, old dust, and cold steel. Rain tapped softly against the curved roof overhead, while wind whispered through cracks in the walls. The floorboards shifted beneath Elias's weight with tired sighs. Someone had once tried to make the place livable years ago. A rusted lantern hung near the far wall. An overturned crate sat beside a narrow bench coated in dust. Newspapers from another decade lay scattered across the corners like fallen leaves. Ranger paced slowly through the train car, nose twitching. Then he stopped. Completely. His body stiffened near the rear wall. Elias noticed the change instantly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger didn't bark. He simply stared toward the steel wall at the back of the car while the storm rolled outside. Another flash of lightning illuminated the inside for half a second, and Elias could have sworn he saw something strange reflected across the metal surface. A warm yellow glow. Gone instantly. He frowned and looked again. Nothing. Just rust and shadows. Probably lightning, he whispered to himself, though the explanation felt thin the moment he said it aloud. Ranger let out a low sound deep in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. The kind Elias had heard only a handful of times during their years together. Slowly, the dog approached the wall. One careful step after another. Then he pressed his nose against the cold steel and stood perfectly still. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains. Inside the train car, something answered. 3 soft knocks echoed faintly from somewhere behind the wall. The sound came again almost a full minute later. 3 slow knocks from somewhere beyond the steel wall. Not loud, not threatening. Soft enough that Elias wondered if exhaustion was finally beginning to twist his mind the way loneliness sometimes did after too many silent roads and too many cold nights. But Ranger heard it too. The German shepherd stepped backward from the wall with his ears sharply forward and his body tense beneath the dim flashes of stormlight. Elias moved carefully across the creaking floorboards and pressed his palm against the rusted steel. Cold, solid, yet beneath his fingertips, he felt the faintest vibration pulse through the metal, subtle as a heartbeat hidden deep underground. The sensation vanished almost instantly. Wind moaned outside the train car, carrying rain against the roof in uneven waves. "Old pipes," Elias whispered, though there were no pipes anywhere nearby. Ranger glanced toward him briefly, the way he sometimes did when Elias said things neither of them believed. Another flash of lightning illuminated the interior. For half a second, The steel wall reflected something impossible again. Warm amber light, like lantern glow flickering somewhere behind the metal itself. Elias stepped back slowly. His chest tightened with the strange, uneasy feeling that the train car was not abandoned at all. Ranger suddenly pawed once at the floor near the wall. Then again. Scratch. Scratch. Elias crouched beside him and brushed away years of dirt and dust with his sleeve. Beneath the grime, the wooden boards looked different there. Slightly warped. Water-stained. As if moisture had seeped upward from below for decades. He grabbed the old lantern hanging nearby and shook it gently. Surprisingly, there was still a little fuel left inside. After several tries, the wick finally caught, spreading weak golden light through the train car. Shadows stretched across the curved ceiling like dark ribs overhead. Ranger remained fixed on the same spot. Elias reached into his pack and pulled out a folding utility knife along with a small pry bar he kept from his days repairing bridges and generators across half-forgotten towns. Slowly he wedged the bar beneath one of the floorboards. The wood groaned but did not break. Dust drifted upward into the lantern light. Beneath the storm outside, another sound emerged. Faint, rhythmic, like paper softly brushing together somewhere underneath the floor. Elias froze. Ranger released a low whine in his throat. Not fear this time. Curiosity. The kind that always appeared before the dog discovered something hidden. Elias worked the pry bar harder until one narrow board finally lifted with a brittle crack. Cold air breathed upward from the darkness below, carrying a scent so unexpected it made him pause. Instantly, old paper, dry cedar, lavender. The smell felt untouched by time itself. Ranger pushed his nose toward the opening and inhaled deeply. His tail moved once, slowly. Elias lowered the lantern closer. Beneath the floorboards was not dirt or rusted machinery like he expected. There was empty space. A narrow compartment hidden under the rear section of the train car. He could just barely make out the edge of what looked like another wooden hatch several feet below. Then the lantern flame flickered violently. A distant metallic groan echoed somewhere outside across the abandoned rail yard. Elias looked toward the broken doorway. Through the sheets of rain, he noticed something standing far down the tracks near the dead signal tower. A light, small and steady, golden against the darkness. It remained there only a moment before vanishing completely. Ranger stared into the storm with silent focus, his ears rigid and unmoving. Elias swallowed slowly and looked back toward the hidden space beneath the floor. Whatever this train car had been carrying all those years ago, somehow part of it was still waiting here. The storm weakened sometime after midnight, but the wind still moved across the rail yard with a lonely hollow whistle that echoed between the dead tracks and broken signal posts. Elias sat near the open floor compartment with the lantern resting beside him, while Ranger remained close to the hidden space beneath the train car, watching it with unwavering attention. The old dog had not relaxed once since the knocking began. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward sounds Elias could barely notice. Tiny vibrations. Faint creaks inside the walls. The train car itself seemed to settle differently now, as though waking slowly after years of silence. Elias rubbed tiredness from his eyes and leaned closer to the opening in the floorboards. Cold air continued drifting upward, carrying that same impossible scent of cedar, lavender, and old paper untouched by moisture or decay. It reminded him strangely of the letters his mother used to keep tied with ribbon in a kitchen drawer back in Spokane before life became measured in deployments and highways. Ranger suddenly stood and stared toward the far corner of the train car. His body stiffened again. Then came the sound. Soft footsteps outside on wet gravel. Elias immediately lowered the lantern flame and turned toward the broken doorway. Rain still shimmered lightly beneath the distant rail lights, but no one stood there. The empty tracks stretched into darkness without movement. Even so, the feeling remained. The unmistakable sense that someone had just passed nearby. Ranger released a low breath through his nose and slowly relaxed. Elias looked back toward the compartment beneath the floor. Curiosity had already rooted itself too deeply to ignore. He grabbed the lantern and carefully widened the opening enough to lower himself through. Rusted metal groaned softly around him as his boots found an old iron ladder bolted inside the narrow cavity beneath the train car. Dust drifted through the lantern glow like pale smoke. Ranger immediately climbed down after him without hesitation. The hidden space below was larger than Elias expected, nearly 7 feet wide and stretching the full length beneath the rear section of the rail car. The walls were reinforced with dark cedar planks aged almost black with time. Unlike the freezing air above, this place held a strange dry warmth, sealed away from decades of Montana winters. Along the walls stood shelves, hundreds of them, and on every shelf sat bundles of letters tied carefully with faded cloth ribbon. Elias stopped breathing for a moment. Thousands of envelopes rested silently in the lantern glow, like sleeping voices waiting for someone to finally hear them. Some were yellowed with age. Others looked almost untouched. Stamps carried dates from different decades: 1944, 1952, 1968. Handwriting covered every envelope in careful ink now softened by time. Ranger moved slowly through the room, nose brushing near the shelves with surprising gentleness. Then he paused beside a small wooden desk at the far end. Elias approached carefully. On the desk sat a tarnished brass nameplate barely visible beneath dust. Samuel Whitaker, Railway Postal Clerk. Beside it rested an old pocket watch, stopped permanently at 2:17. Elias lifted the lantern higher. The walls behind the desk were covered with maps of railway routes crossing Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas. Some sections were circled repeatedly in red pencil. Others had notes written in shaky handwriting beside them. Storm delays. Transfer rerouted. Hold for pickup. Then Elias noticed something else beneath the desk. A leather satchel partially hidden in shadow. Ranger nudged it gently with his nose. The leather cracked softly as Elias lifted it onto the desk. Inside rested several unopened letters separated from the others with careful precision. One envelope lay on top. The paper looked newer than the rest. Cleaner. Almost preserved. And written across the front in dark, steady handwriting were 2 words that made Elias freeze completely. Margaret Mercer. Elias stared at the envelope while the lantern flame trembled softly beside him. For a long moment, he did not move at all. The sound of rain above the train car had faded into a distant whisper now, leaving only the faint groan of old steel cooling in the mountain night. Margaret Mercer. His mother's name looked impossibly alive written across the envelope in dark, careful ink. He slowly lowered himself into the chair beside the desk, the old wood creaking beneath his weight. Ranger sat close against his leg, silent and watchful. Elias turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper felt dry and firm despite the decades that must have passed. No stamp marked the corner. No return address. Only the name. He traced the handwriting carefully with his thumb, and a memory surfaced so suddenly it stole the air from his chest. His mother standing beside a kitchen window during winter, snow falling outside while she sorted unpaid bills and old birthday cards beneath yellow light. She had always kept letters, even after his father disappeared when Elias was 9 years old. Especially after. Every few months she would walk to the mailbox with hope she never admitted aloud. Then slowly that hope faded into silence the same way daylight disappears from small towns in winter. Elias swallowed hard and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting matched the outside. Strong, steady, familiar in ways he could not explain. Margaret, if this reaches you, then maybe the world still allows broken things to find their way home. I am sorry for every season you waited beside that porch light. I am sorry for every birthday I missed and every promise I could not keep. There are things happening here that I do not fully understand. The rail company says the letters are delayed because of weather and rerouting, but some of us know better now. Samuel believes someone wants these deliveries forgotten. If anything happens, I left something for Elias. Tell him I carried his photograph every mile west of Chicago. Tell him none of this was because I stopped loving him. Elias stopped reading. His vision blurred suddenly. He lowered the paper slowly while the lantern light shook against the walls around him. Ranger rested his head gently against Elias's knee without making a sound. The old dog seemed to understand grief better than most people ever could. Elias stared at the remaining page for a long time before forcing himself to continue. There is a storage room beneath the northern depot in Black Hollow. Samuel hid the records there after the accident. If the letters are ever found, maybe the truth will finally breathe again. Maybe families waiting all these years will finally know they were not forgotten. I do not know if I will make it back east. The storms here have become dangerous, and there are rumors the line will be shut down before winter. But if Elias ever reads this, tell him the finest thing I ever built was not a bridge or a rail line. It was being his father for the short time heaven allowed me to stay. The letter ended there. No signature beneath the final line. Only a faint water stain near the corner, as though someone else had once held the page with trembling hands. Elias leaned back slowly, unable to speak. Outside, wind drifted through the rail yard, carrying the lonely cry of distant train cables moving against rusted poles. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the far wall behind the desk. Elias followed his gaze. There, nearly hidden beneath a hanging railway map, stood another narrow steel door he had not noticed before. And from somewhere beyond it came the faint sound of papers rustling softly in the dark, as though unseen hands were still searching through the letters after all these years. The hidden steel door resisted at first as though decades of silence had sealed it shut from the inside. Elias planted his shoulder carefully against the cold metal and pushed harder while rust cracked softly around the hinges. Ranger stood close beside him, alert and unmoving, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the narrow opening. At last the door groaned inward with a long, weary sound that echoed through the underground compartment like an old breath finally released. Cold air drifted out carrying dust, cedar, and the faint mineral scent of rainwater buried deep underground. Elias lifted the lantern higher and stepped carefully through. The room beyond was smaller than the letter chamber, but stranger somehow. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled not with envelopes, but with wooden archive boxes stamped with railway symbols and faded government markings. Old clocks hung frozen at different times. A telegraph machine rested silent beneath a layer of dust thick enough to soften its edges. Above everything else lingered the overwhelming stillness of a place untouched by human hands for generations. Ranger moved ahead slowly, nails clicking softly against the concrete floor. Then he stopped near the center of the room beside a large table covered with yellowed railway maps and stacks of handwritten records. Elias noticed immediately that one lantern already sat there, lit. The flame flickered low and steady beside an open ledger book. Elias froze. The lantern was warm. Not hot enough to have been lit recently, but not cold either. Ranger lowered his head slightly and sniffed the air. Outside somewhere above them, thunder rolled faintly across the mountains. Elias approached the table carefully. The open ledger contained names. Hundreds of them. Delivery records. Missing transfers. Unclaimed routes. Entire pages marked with red ink beside dates stretching back more than 60 years. Then he noticed a sentence written across the top margin in hurried, uneven handwriting. The letters deserve to reach home, even if we do not. Elias read the line twice. Something about it tightened painfully in his chest. The room no longer felt abandoned. It felt preserved, guarded, as though someone had stayed behind long after the world forgot this rail yard existed. Ranger suddenly turned toward the far wall and gave one quiet bark. Elias followed him deeper into the room, where another shelf leaned crookedly beside a rusted filing cabinet. Tucked behind it stood a framed black and white photograph covered in dust. Elias wiped the glass gently with his sleeve. The picture showed 5 railway clerks standing beside a mail car sometime during winter many decades earlier. Snow covered the tracks around them. One man held a lantern. Another smiled beside stacks of mailbags piled waist-high. Elias studied the faces carefully until his breath caught again. The man standing at the far left looked painfully familiar. Same square jowl. Same deep-set eyes. Same calm expression hidden beneath exhaustion. Younger, but unmistakable. His father. Ranger leaned close beside him while Elias stared silently at the photograph. Beneath the frame, faded handwriting read black hollow postal line. Final winter route. January 1968. Elias felt the room tilt slightly around him. He had spent most of his life believing his father vanished somewhere between temporary jobs and broken promises. But now another possibility stood quietly before him beneath the lantern light. Maybe his father never abandoned them at all. Maybe something here had kept him from ever returning home. Wind moaned faintly through hidden ventilation shafts above the room, sounding almost like distant voices carried through old tunnels. Elias lowered the photograph slowly and noticed one final object resting behind the frame. A brass locker key attached to a weathered tag. Northern Depot. Locker 27. Rangers stared toward the key with focused intensity while somewhere far above them, beyond the dead tracks and broken signals, the lonely sound of a train horn drifted softly through the storm despite no active railway running through Black Hollow for over 30 years. By morning the storm had passed beyond the mountains, leaving Black Hollow wrapped in a pale gray silence that made the abandoned rail yard feel suspended outside time itself. Thin mist drifted low across the dead tracks while beads of rainwater clung to rusted signal posts like cold glass. Elias climbed out of the hidden chamber beneath the train car, carrying the brass locker key tightly in his coat pocket. Ranger followed close beside him, shaking rainwater from his thick fur before stopping near the edge of the tracks to scan the empty town beyond the rail yard. The old dog seemed restless now, alert in a deeper way Elias had learned not to ignore. Somewhere inside him, something had already changed. For years he had drifted from town to town carrying the quiet belief that some people simply disappeared from the world because there was nowhere left for them to belong. But now every unanswered silence surrounding his father no longer felt empty. It felt unfinished. The northern depot stood nearly half a mile beyond the abandoned yard near the edge of town where the mountains narrowed into pine-covered ridges. Elias and Ranger followed the cracked rail line through wet weeds and broken gravel while morning wind whispered softly through telephone wires overhead. Most of Black Hollow still slept beneath the cold dawn. A diner sign flickered weakly near Main Street. Smoke rose from two distant chimneys. Otherwise, the town looked forgotten by the modern world, preserved in the same stillness as the hidden letters underground. The depot emerged slowly through the fog. Built from dark stone and weathered timber, the structure leaned slightly with age, its roof sagging beneath decades of snow and hard winters. Broken windows reflected the pale morning sky. Faded lettering above the entrance still read Northern Pacific Postal Terminal, though several letters had long since fallen away. Ranger stopped suddenly outside the entrance and stared toward the upper windows. Elias followed his gaze. For just a second, he thought he saw movement behind the dusty glass. A figure crossing slowly inside the depot. Then nothing. Only shadows. The front doors were locked with thick, rusted chains, but a side entrance near the loading platform hung partially open. Inside, the air smelled of mildew, wet cedar, and ancient paper. Sunlight filtered weakly through broken skylights overhead, illuminating rows of abandoned mail carts and overturned benches coated in dust. Somewhere water dripped steadily through the silence. Elias moved deeper into the depot while Ranger padded ahead across the cracked tile floor. The locker numbers began near the rear hallway beneath a faded arrivals board frozen permanently on October 14, 1968. Most locker doors hung open or rusted shut, but locker 27 remained untouched near the far wall, its brass keyhole surprisingly clean compared to everything around it. Elias removed the key from his pocket slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he slid it into the lock. For a moment nothing happened. Then the mechanism clicked softly. The locker door creaked open. Inside rested a small wooden box wrapped carefully in oilcloth beside another bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Ranger sat quietly beside him as Elias lifted the box into the pale light. Beneath the lid lay dozens of undeveloped film rolls, railway documents, and one final envelope addressed simply to Elias Mercer. The handwriting matched the earlier letter exactly. But before Elias could open it, a sudden sound echoed through the depot behind them. Footsteps, slow and deliberate across the old tile floor. Elias turned instantly. At the far end of the hallway stood an elderly man wearing a dark wool coat and holding a lantern despite the daylight pouring through the broken windows. His silver beard moved slightly in the cold draft drifting through the station. He studied Elias silently for a long moment before finally speaking in a voice roughened by age and years of loneliness. I wondered if someone from the Mercer family would ever come back for the letters. The old man stepped closer through the pale shafts of morning light filtering down from the broken skylights above. His boots moved slowly across the cracked depot floor with the careful balance of someone carrying too many winters in his bones. The lantern in his hand cast a warm amber glow against the cold gray station walls even though daylight already filled the building. Ranger remained still beside Elias, alert but calm, watching the stranger with steady amber eyes. The old man noticed the dog first and gave the faintest nod. "Good shepherd," he murmured quietly. Rail dogs always knew more than people did. His voice carried the rough softness of age, weathered like old cedar left too long in mountain snow. Elias straightened slowly, still holding the wooden box against his chest. "You knew my father?" The old man stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, he simply studied Elias's face as though searching through memories buried beneath time. Then he sighed softly. "You have his eyes," he said. Thomas Mercer never stopped talking about his boy back east. The words landed inside Elias like distant thunder rolling across deep water. Nobody had spoken his father's name aloud in front of him for nearly 20 years. Ranger stepped forward quietly and sniffed the old man's hand. The stranger smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ear with trembling fingers. "Name is Walter Green," he said. "I worked the depot routes with your father during the final winter before the line closed." Elias glanced down at the envelope still resting inside the open locker. Questions crowded his mind too fast to sort through. What happened here? Walter looked around the depot slowly. Dust drifted through the light overhead while wind whispered faintly through shattered windows. "Greed happened," he answered at last. The rail company started shutting down routes during the late 60s. Towns like Black Hollow stopped matching. Mail disappeared. Entire shipments vanished without explanation. Some letters carried land deeds, military records, insurance claims. Important things. But Thomas and Samuel discovered certain deliveries were being hidden on purpose. Elias listened without moving. Walter continued slowly. "Some powerful men stood to gain a great deal if those letters never reached the people waiting for them. Farms got abandoned. Property taxes went unpaid. Families lost homes they never even knew belonged to them." He paused beside the lockers and rested one hand against the cold metal doors. "Your father refused to stay quiet about it." Silence settled heavily across the depot. Somewhere far outside, a train crossing bell rang faintly in the distance, even though no train tracks remained active for 50 miles. Walter looked toward the sound with distant eyes before speaking again. The winter storm came hard that year, January of 1968. Samuel hid the letters beneath the rail car before the inspectors arrived. Thomas stayed behind to help move the remaining records out of the depot. Elias swallowed carefully. "Did he die here?" Walter's weathered face tightened with quiet sadness. "No," he said softly. "At least not that night." He reached into his coat pocket and removed an old silver compass scratched by time. "Your father gave me this before he left Black Hollow. Said if his son ever came looking one day, I was to tell him something important." Walter placed the compass gently into Elias's hand. The metal felt cold from years of waiting. "Thomas said the world breaks people sometimes," Walter whispered. "But kindness leaves tracks behind, even after the storms come." Elias stared down at the compass while Ranger rested against his leg in silence. Then Walter pointed slowly toward the envelope, still waiting inside locker 27. "Open that one," he said quietly. "Your father spent 3 nights riding it beside the station furnace while the snow buried the whole valley. He said it mattered more than anything else he ever carried on those rails." The envelope opened with a soft crackle beneath Elias's fingers while pale morning light drifted through the depot windows in long silver beams. Dust moved lazily through the air around him like quiet snowfall suspended in time. Walter stood near the old benches with his lantern resting at his side, saying nothing. Ranger settled onto the cold tile floor beside Elias, calm now, though his ears still twitched toward every distant sound echoing through the forgotten station. Elias unfolded the letter slowly. The paper smelled faintly of cedar smoke and machine oil, carrying the dry scent of another lifetime. "My son, if these words ever find you, then heaven has been kinder to us than I deserve to hope. Right now the snow outside Black Hollow is deeper than I have ever seen, and the wind sounds like old trains crying through the mountains. Samuel is asleep beside the furnace while Walter keeps watch near the tracks. We are trying to protect the letters until the storm passes, though I no longer believe the storm is only weather." Elias paused for a moment, hearing his father's voice inside the words so clearly it made the empty depot around him feel suddenly smaller. He continued reading while Ranger rested his head quietly against his boot. "There are people in this world who believe money matters more than promises. They think forgotten towns and lonely families disappear quietly if enough mail goes missing. But every envelope in these rooms belongs to somebody waiting for hope. A father, a daughter, a soldier, a widow. Sometimes a single letter is the only proof a person was loved at all. Elias felt his throat tighten painfully. Outside the depot, wind brushed softly against the old windows, while somewhere farther down Main Street a church bell rang 9 slow times through the morning fog. Your mother once told me that kindness is never truly lost. It travels quietly from one soul to another like light passing through windows at night. I did not understand that when I was younger. I understand it now. If I do not make it home, then I need you to know something important. None of this was your fault. Not my absence. Not the silence that followed. I carried your photograph every day after I left Spokane. When the snow trapped us here, I kept it inside my coat beside my heart, because fathers are supposed to carry home with them wherever they go. Elias lowered his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the sudden ache rising through his chest. Walter watched him quietly from across the depot, his weathered face touched by the same grief he had likely carried for decades. Elias forced himself to continue. Samuel discovered proof that certain railway executives were hiding land claims and military compensation letters from veterans returning after the war. Families lost farms. Men never received pensions they earned. Some people died believing they had simply been forgotten. We stayed behind because somebody had to protect the truth until the right hands finally found it. If you are reading this now, perhaps those hands are yours. Beneath the final paragraph rested one last line written more carefully than all the others. There is enough goodness left in this world to rebuild what was broken, son. Even now. Especially now. Elias folded the letter slowly while silence settled across the depot once more. Ranger lifted his head suddenly and looked toward the depot entrance. Outside, several townspeople had begun gathering quietly near the tracks after hearing rumors about the hidden mail room beneath the rail car. Old men in heavy coats, elderly women holding faded photographs, faces worn by years and winters and unanswered questions. Walter stepped beside Elias and looked out through the dusty windows. They have been waiting longer than you can imagine, he said softly. Some of them never stopped believing the letters were still out there somewhere. Snow arrived again 3 nights later, drifting softly across Black Hollow in slow white spirals that turned the old rail yard silver beneath the evening sky. The abandoned train car no longer stood alone in silence. Warm lanterns now glowed through its cracked windows each night, casting gentle amber light across the dead tracks where weeds once grew untouched between rusted rails. Word about the hidden letters had spread far beyond the valley. People arrived from neighboring towns carrying faded photographs, military records, wedding portraits, and old envelopes returned to them after half a lifetime of waiting. Some cried quietly when they recognized familiar handwriting. Others simply sat in silence holding letters against their chests while snow fell softly outside. Elias watched it all from the doorway of the restored rail car with Ranger lying beside him beneath a wool blanket near the heater stove Walter had helped install earlier that morning. The old German shepherd looked peaceful now, his amber eyes reflecting firelight instead of storm clouds. Every so often someone would kneel to scratch behind his ears and whisper gratitude as though the dog himself had guided the letters home. Maybe he had. Elias no longer dismissed the possibility of strange things. Not after everything the mountains had returned to him. The hidden chamber beneath the rail car had slowly become something sacred to the town. Walter called it the memory room. The shelves remained lined with bundles of carefully sorted letters. But now volunteers worked daily beside long wooden tables cataloging names and destinations while old record players hummed softly through the underground rooms. The air smelled of cedar, coffee, and aged paper instead of dust and loneliness. Some nights Elias stayed awake long after everyone left, reading letters beneath lantern light while wind moved gently across the frozen valley outside. Stories of love, forgiveness, regret, hope. Entire lives folded carefully into envelopes that had somehow survived decades buried beneath silence. One evening, an elderly woman from Idaho arrived carrying a photograph of a young soldier she had once planned to marry before he vanished during the winter of 1968. Her hands trembled as Elias placed a letter into them tied with faded blue ribbon. She opened it slowly beside the station furnace while snow whispered against the depot windows. Then she smiled through tears and said softly, "He never forgot me." That moment stayed with Elias longer than he expected, because for most of his life, he had believed forgotten people simply disappeared into the world like smoke carried off by wind. But now he understood something different. Some things waited patiently to be found when the right heart finally arrived. Late one night after the volunteers had gone home, Elias stood alone outside beside the tracks while Ranger rested nearby, watching snow drift across the valley. The mountains glowed pale beneath moonlight. The old depot windows shone warmly behind him. Somewhere far in the distance, a train horn echoed softly through the frozen dark, even though no trains passed through Black Hollow anymore. Elias smiled faintly instead of questioning it. He reached into his coat pocket and held his father's silver compass beneath the stars. The needle no longer spun aimlessly the way it once had. It pointed steadily toward the rail car, glowing warmly against the snow. Toward home. Walter stepped quietly onto the platform beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee that steamed gently in the winter air. "Funny thing about lost letters," the old man said softly while handing Elias one of the cups. "Sometimes they arrive exactly when people need them most." Elias looked toward the warm lantern light shining through the train car windows where Ranger had finally fallen asleep beside stacks of delivered mail. For the first